In 1943, on a frozen island at the edge of the world, a forgotten battle raged on American soil. Its winds screamed across mountains of fog and tundra, carrying the echoes of two nations at war. This was Attu, an island so remote that few Americans had ever heard its name. Yet here, on May 11th, 1943, American soldiers would fight and die to reclaim their homeland from the Japanese Empire. The story of Attu begins almost a year earlier in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. Japan, emboldened by its early victories, sought to expand its defensive perimeter deep into the Pacific. The Aleutian Islands, a chain stretching like a broken bridge between Alaska and Asia, were a tempting prize. They offered control over northern sea routes and, perhaps more importantly, a way to divert American attention from the Central Pacific. In June 1942, as Japanese carriers steamed toward Midway, another task force, under Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya, struck north. On June 3rd, Japanese bombers attacked Dutch Harbor, Alaska. 2 days later, soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army landed on the islands of Attu and Kiska. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign troops occupied American soil. The occupation was small, just over 2,000 men on Attu, commanded by Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki. But the psychological impact was enormous. To many Americans, the idea of Japanese troops on U.S. land was unthinkable. For Japan, it was a symbolic foothold, proof that their empire could reach across the Pacific itself. Yet Attu was no paradise. The island was a desolate wasteland, treeless, wind-lashed, and perpetually shrouded in fog. Temperatures hovered near freezing even in summer. Rain and sleet came almost daily. Japanese soldiers, trained for tropical warfare, now faced cold, hunger, and isolation. Their supply lines stretched thin, often broken by American submarines. Rations were reduced to handfuls of rice. Their shelters, dugouts carved into frozen soil, offered little protection from the elements. Frostbite and illness spread faster than ammunition could be delivered. Still, Yamasaki's men endured. They built bunkers, strung barbed wire, and dug firing pits across the island's ridges. They prepared for what they knew would come, an American attempt to reclaim the Aleutians. Meanwhile, in Washington and Alaska, U.S. commanders planned their counterattack. The mission was codenamed Operation Landcrab. The goal, to retake Attu, drive out the Japanese, and restore American control over the Aleutians. The task would fall to the 7th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Albert E. Brown, but the division had trained not in cold, but in heat. They came from the deserts of California, where they had prepared for operations in North Africa. Instead, they were now being sent to the subarctic. The men were issued cold weather gear that often failed in the damp cold. Their boots froze solid overnight. Some soldiers joked bitterly that they had been shipped from the hottest place on earth to the coldest. On May 11th, 1943, the invasion began. At dawn, U.S. Navy destroyers and cruisers opened fire on Attu's coastline, blasting suspected Japanese positions. Carrier planes roared overhead through breaks in the fog, dropping bombs that disappeared into white clouds. Then the landing craft came, hundreds of them, packed with shivering soldiers gripping their rifles. The sea was rough, the wind merciless. Men stumbled through the surf at Massacre Bay and Holtz Bay, weighed down by packs and weapons. They expected machine gun fire. Instead, silence. The Japanese were nowhere to be seen. Unbeknownst to the Americans, Yamasaki had ordered his men to withdraw from the beaches and wait inland. He wanted the enemy to come to him, to fight in terrain he had prepared, not on the open coast. The Americans advanced cautiously, their boots sinking into the mud, visibility barely 50 yards. Every ridge looked the same, grey, frozen, and wrapped in mist. Navigation was nearly impossible. Entire platoons became lost within minutes of landing. By nightfall, the 7th Division had secured small beachheads, but at great cost. The cold and exhaustion took their toll. Dozens collapsed from exposure before ever meeting the enemy. Rations froze solid. Medic tents were overwhelmed with cases of hypothermia. In the following days, U.S. forces began pushing inland toward the high ground. The terrain was unforgiving. Fog blanketed everything. Compasses failed. Mud swallowed equipment whole. The men trudged forward inch by inch, unsure if the enemy was 10 feet away or 10 miles. And then the fog erupted in gunfire. Japanese snipers opened up from hidden positions. Machine guns rattled from unseen nests in the hills. Mortar shells fell from the mist, bursting among the American ranks. Panic swept through the line. Soldiers dropped flat, firing blindly into the fog. Officers shouted orders that vanished in the wind. The battle for Attu had begun. What followed would not be a fight for glory or territory. It would be a fight against the land, the weather, and despair itself. The Americans had brought overwhelming numbers, over 15,000 troops backed by artillery and aircraft. But on Attu, numbers meant little. The fog was the great equalizer, and Yamasaki's defenders knew how to use it. They moved silently between ridges, striking, vanishing, reappearing miles away. Every step forward for the Americans was earned in blood. A single bunker could hold up an entire company. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards. As the first week dragged on, the U.S. 17th and 32nd Regiments found themselves locked in constant skirmishes. The cold bit through every layer of clothing. Rifles jammed, grenades froze, even matches wouldn't light, but they kept moving, because they had to, because somewhere out there, in the fog and ice, was the enemy who had taken a piece of America. And on the other side of the island, Colonel Yamasaki waited, knowing that his men could not win, but determined that they would not surrender. The fog never lifted. Day after day it hung over the island like a living thing, thick, wet, and unrelenting. It clung to the rifles, the uniforms, the very lungs of the men who fought in it. To the soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division, Attu felt less like an island and more like a trap. By May 13, 1943, American troops had pushed inland from their beachheads, moving toward Jamin Pass, a narrow valley that split the island's central ridges. The Japanese defenders, under Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, waited among the rocks and snowdrifts, invisible until they fired. Every hill had a name now: Engineer Hill, Fishhook Ridge, Cleavesy Pass, names that meant nothing to the world, but everything to the men fighting there. The Americans fought not only the enemy, but the land itself. Mud froze and thawed in cycles, sucking at boots and swallowing gear. Snow turned to rain, then back to snow. Wounded men were carried on makeshift sleds over ground that broke beneath their rescuers' feet. Medics worked with frost-bitten hands, their bandages soaked with blood and sleet. Food was scarce. Sleep was rare. Soldiers dug foxholes in the permafrost with bayonets. At night, Japanese infiltrators crept through the mist, throwing grenades into tents before vanishing again. There were no front lines, only confusion and fear. Still, the Americans pushed forward. The 17th Infantry advanced toward the ridges above Holt's Bay, while the 32nd moved through the valleys toward Chichagof Harbor. Each yard was contested. Each hilltop cost lives. By May 16th, they reached the first major Japanese stronghold, Fishhook Ridge. Here, Yamasaki's men had dug deep trenches and fortified bunkers connected by tunnels. From these positions, they could sweep the approaches with machine gun and mortar fire. The Americans launched attack after attack. Each time they climbed into the fog, and each time they were driven back by gunfire they could not see. The wounded slid down the slopes into the mud below. The air reeked of cordite, sulfur, and decay. Artillery fire thundered across the island. US 105mm howitzers pounded the ridges for hours, but when the infantry advanced, the Japanese were still there, waiting. One soldier of the 17th Infantry, Private First Class Howard Sorensen, later recalled, "You never saw them until they were shooting at you. The fog was so thick you could walk right past a man and never know it. I remember crawling up that hill, mud to my elbows, and hearing the bullets slap into the ground in front of me. You just kept moving, because if you stopped, you'd freeze or die where you were." Sorensen's squad lost half its men in that assault. When night fell, they dug in among the rocks, using the bodies of the dead for cover. It was that kind of battle, cold, close, and merciless. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ridge, Colonel Yamasaki watched the battle unfold through a cracked pair of field glasses. His men were exhausted. Their ammunition was running low. Supplies had not arrived in weeks. Yet surrender was not an option. A Japanese survivor, Sergeant Kinjiro Matsuda, would later describe their resolve. "We had no thought of returning home. Our commander told us that to live as prisoners would bring shame to our families. We believed him. We believed it was better to die with honor on the mountain than to live in defeat." For Matsuda and his comrades, Attu was not just a battlefield. It was a graveyard they had already accepted. By May 18th, the Americans had finally taken Fishhook Ridge after days of brutal combat, but the victory came at a price. Entire companies were reduced to a handful of men. Frostbite, trench foot, and exhaustion claimed nearly as many casualties as enemy fire. The medics began calling it death by inches. On May 19th, the battle shifted to Jarmin Pass, a narrow defile that connected the valleys of Holtz and Chichagof. It became the most fiercely contested ground on Attu. The Japanese had interlocking bunkers on both sides of the pass. Every movement by the Americans drew fire from multiple angles. Machine guns raked the slopes. Mortars fell in deadly rhythm. Lieutenant Robert Landis, a platoon leader with the 32nd Infantry, described the scene in his diary. "We tried to flank them, but there was no flanking on Attu. The mountains just went straight up. Every ridge you took, there was another one higher behind it. I remember thinking, this is what hell must look like, white, cold, and endless." After a week of combat, the Americans finally broke through. Jarmin Pass fell, but at a staggering cost. The 32nd Infantry lost nearly 600 men killed or wounded, progress measured in feet, bought with blood. By late May, Yamasaki's remaining force had been pushed back to the high ground above Chichagof harbor, their last defensive line. They were out of food, nearly out of ammunition, and cut off from escape. Yet they continued to fight night after night against an enemy that now surrounded them on all sides. In one desperate raid, Japanese soldiers stormed an American command post under the cover of fog. They bayoneted sentries and destroyed radios before disappearing again into the mist. It was a haunting echo of their training, silent, swift, and fearless. American morale was fraying. Men who had survived days of combat without sleep began to hallucinate in the fog. Some believed they saw ghostly figures moving through the snow. Others wept silently in their foxholes, clutching frozen letters from home. Still, the attacks continued. By May 25th, the last Japanese positions were being bombarded day and night. Shells rained down from land and sea. Flamethrowers cleared bunkers one by one. But even as they burned, some defenders refused to surrender. The Americans were beginning to realize the scale of the resistance and the fanatic resolve of their enemy. They knew the end was coming. What they did not know was that Yamasaki had planned something extraordinary for that end. On the night of May 28th, as the snow began to fall again, he gathered his remaining men. Perhaps 800 of them still stood, out of more than 2,500 who had landed a year earlier. They had no artillery left, few rifles, and almost no ammunition. Yamasaki told them they would launch one final attack, a banzai charge, to die with honor. The next morning, May 29, 1943, would bring the largest suicide assault of the Pacific War on a forgotten island in the Aleutians. Dawn broke cold and grey over the mountains of Attu, May 29, 1943. The fog that had smothered the island for weeks thinned for a moment, revealing the frozen slopes of Engineer Hill below. American troops of the 7th Infantry Division were beginning another day of cautious advance, unaware that their enemy was about to descend upon them in a final desperate act. At first, there was silence. Then, from the ridgeline above, came a sound unlike anything they had heard before, a low roar, human, rising, unstoppable. Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki led the charge himself. He and his remaining men, around 800 in total, hurled themselves out of the fog and down the slopes toward the American lines. They carried bayonets, swords, even shovels. Some had no weapons at all. They screamed as they came, the traditional banzai cry echoing through the valley. "Tenno heika banzai!" Long live the Emperor! The Americans were caught completely off guard. Engineers, medics, cooks, anyone within reach, grabbed rifles and fought back. For a moment, the lines collapsed into chaos. Yamasaki's men broke through the perimeter, overrunning a field hospital and a supply dump. Wounded soldiers were bayoneted in their cots. Command tents were torn apart by hand-to-hand combat. American officers rallied what men they could, forming defensive circles around their machine guns. Sergeant William White of the 50th Engineer Battalion later recalled, "They came out of the fog like ghosts. There was no warning, just shouting and gunfire. We were firing point blank into the crowd, and still they kept coming. You couldn't believe how determined they were. I'll never forget the sound of it, the yelling, the steel, the sheer madness of it all." For nearly 2 hours the battle raged at close quarters. Rifles, pistols, knives, fists. No front lines, no strategy, only survival. Yamasaki's men fought with ferocity born of despair. One group overran an American mortar crew and turned their own weapons against them. Another seized a machine gun and fired until every man in the nest was dead. Colonel Yamasaki himself was shot and killed leading the assault near the base of Engineer Hill. He died with his sword in hand, shouting for his men to continue. By mid-morning the charge had spent itself. The Americans regrouped and counterattacked with overwhelming force. Machine guns and grenades tore through the remaining Japanese soldiers. When the last shots faded, Engineer Hill was littered with bodies, hundreds of them lying still in the melting snow. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison had been annihilated. Only 28 soldiers were taken prisoner. The rest were dead. For the Americans, victory came at a terrible price. More than 550 were killed and over 1,100 wounded, many from frostbite, exposure, or friendly fire in the confusion. The 7th Infantry Division had won the last battle ever fought on American soil, but few of them felt like victors. The island was silent now. The wind howled across the tundra, carrying with it the smell of death and fuel oil. The once pristine snow was stained with rust and blood. In the days that followed, burial parties worked to collect the bodies. They found Japanese soldiers who had died by their own grenades, clutching family photos or flags signed by loved ones. Many had written final letters that would never be sent. Among the American dead was Lieutenant Robert Landis, the same officer who had once described Attu as white, cold, and endless. His platoon buried him near the ridge he had helped take, marking the spot with a rough wooden cross. By June 1st, the island was officially declared secure. The Battle of Attu was over. The United States had reclaimed the first of its lost territory, but few outside of the Aleutians even knew the battle had taken place. For the Japanese, Attu was a tragedy, a lesson in the futility of isolated defense. For the Americans, it was a warning that the Pacific War would not be won easily or cheaply. The cost was staggering. Of the 2,500 Japanese troops who had defended Attu, only 29 survived. The Americans suffered over 3,800 casualties, more than 25% of their entire landing force, all for an island just 15 miles wide, shrouded in fog, forgotten by most of the world. But Attu mattered. It marked the turning point in the Aleutian campaign. Within weeks, American forces would assault Kiska, only to find the Japanese had already evacuated under cover of fog. The Aleutians were once again in Allied hands. In later years, veterans would struggle to describe what they had seen, not the grand battles of Europe or the tropics, but something far stranger, a war fought in silence and ice, where the enemy came out of the mist and vanished back into it. A Japanese survivor, Sergeant Kenjiro Matsuda, would later write in a post-war memoir, "We thought we were dying for the Emperor, but on that mountain I understood. We were dying for each other. I remember my comrades' faces in the snow. That is what I carried home." For American survivors, the memories were just as haunting. Private Howard Sorensen, decades later, summed it up in a single sentence. "We fought in the clouds, and when the clouds lifted, there was no one left to fight." The Battle of Attu faded from public memory, overshadowed by the larger campaigns that followed: Tarawa, Saipan, Normandy, Okinawa. But for those who were there, it remained a scar carved into the edge of the world. Today, the island stands almost exactly as it did in 1943, windswept, barren, and silent. Rusting helmets and bullet casings lie scattered among the tundra grass. The weathered remains of foxholes still mark the ridgelines, and each year the fog rolls in again, wrapping the island in the same cold shroud that once hid one of the most brutal battles ever fought on American soil. The forgotten Battle of Attu, a place where war met wilderness, where courage and desperation were indistinguishable, and where an entire generation learned that even victory can feel like loss.